So why don't we start, we'll open it up to the crowd/audience.
It's before lunch, so we'll be brief too.
So, quick question for Ashwini.
Yes.
So when you do the analysis and you find that, could it be that people who say, like, didn't find a job or are not doing well in their career, maybe they just don't put their resume on that website where you got the data?
Yes, that's actually, yeah, so I did not talk about that. So what I showed you is a very small subset of the things that you'd want to consider. That's a huge issue. There are a number of issues in the paper. It is true that many of the workers, there's probably going to be a large mass of very large, sort of, let's say, older workers who just leave the labor force following these transactions, and we don't pick them up in our data. And so that's why we try to be very careful to say that it's certainly not the case that everybody is benefiting from these technologies. But what's interesting, though, is that you can imagine, what we did is we looked at, let's say, younger workers who likely, even if they get laid off or get discouraged, they still probably want to stay within the labor force. And what's interesting is that for many of those workers, let's say they leave within 3 to 4 months, you don't see as large of a negative effect as you would have thought. That's not to say that people outside the sample don't experience these things, but from what we observe, it's interesting.
So I have a question. So on the theme of imparting human capital from some experience, François, when you were talking about people working in these different tasks, most of them are very kind of typical Mechanical Turk type. They just rely on human vision, to spot something. Do you see people over time showing an interest in sort of higher order skills, or do you think that that's like a viable path where people could do more complicated but still micro type work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a strong demand for that. We've had people, especially when we present these technologies to, I would say, the younger, sort of more radical people, it's like, we don't want to be monkeys, we don't want to be button clickers. We want to do something that really matters. And I think a lot of the projects that are doing well have thought of a kind of pathway where you are educating yourself in that field, not just sticking with one task, but moving up a ladder, as it were, and learning. And there's a lot of discussion in this field about badging, so virtual badges, not just the ones you tattoo, but ones that could have some value in the real world in terms of, some university giving you a credit for something. So we definitely see people wanting to progress in their knowledge of science. Ultimately, some people, going back to school because of their involvement in projects like this.
That's very exciting. So let me ask another question. So when you were doing the work on the Ashwini, when you were doing work on using these resume things, this was something that was probably a pretty complex parsing task of trying to take a resume, which everyone has sort of used their own version, and turn it into kind of structured data. Did that seem? So I guess where I'm going is, using this kind of crowd labor for the social sciences, and sort of, do you see sort of projects that, if you had a massive army of people who could code things, there's like projects that you would do, if you had that tool in your hands?
Sure. That's a big question. I don't think I'm well equipped to answer it. I would say for sure, when I was listening to some of the things that were talked about, that yes, there's a lot of value in having, let's say, a crowd being able to do a lot of the work that as researchers we wouldn't do. I think it was interesting because a lot of the discussion that was about innovation at firms versus crowdsourcing, the number one question that came to my mind is that I think it's pretty obvious that the types of problems there's certain types of problems and research areas in which crowdsourcing is going to be very useful. And you can imagine there's other types of problems in which you'd want to do that in a firm, where there's incentives to do things. I would say one of my biggest source of value is not so much in parsing data, but hopefully that PhD will come in handy, and then I can at least think about some of the big questions. And that's some of the uses of, I would say, in a big company where you might have people like a Steve Jobs thinking about the big picture and sort of how things work. So I think it's important to use sort of big crowds for answering questions, but there's a lot of value in also having thinkers who can actually piece things together. I'm not sure if that's optimal for crowdsourcing or not.
Right, and that kind of seems like a theme, sort of this division of labor of the problem formulator and
That's
the,
right, yeah.
the person who maybe is doing some of the work that previously either was doing done by the researcher or just wasn't done at all.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, a question to the crowd, since we have many very brilliant people in the crowd here. And I tried to drop this bomb about, well, there's a lot of other people outside in, China, India, Africa, who, potentially could be enormous resources for their local communities or for the globe. What's happening with crowdsourcing around the world? I mean, Kickstarter only works in the US, UK, maybe Netherlands now. What else is going on? What's happening in China and so on? Does anyone have a feel, something to say about where the hot spots are for crowdsourcing around the world and crowdfunding?
I can speak to a little bit about South Korea. I was actually there a couple of weeks back. So crowdfunding is just picking up there. So in South Korea, crowdfunding is just about picking off.
Mm-hmm.
They're also, they tried their hands at, the Kickstarter Indiegogo models of movies, arts, music, books, that sort of thing. But there's a lot more sort of a need/attention towards equity, equity crowdfunding. So it's almost like they're about to kind of bypass the arts, movies stuff and go directly into equity. But the government is obviously like waiting for some of the countries in the West to, lay the ground rules. So I had some conversation with some of the entrepreneurs in this space, and it seems like they are going to jump more into equity, but they are going to look up to the US and the UK to set the rules. And yeah. So.
Great, thanks.
To follow that up, you're sitting with John here, who will have a lot to say about that later today, but in particular thinking about north-south labor markets in crowdsourcing.
So I'm actually going to be talking about something a little different, but I will pick up what Avi is talking about, which is, before I came to NYU, I worked at Odesk, which is an online labor market. And you were kind of asking, so where are the obstacles to something more global? Well, on Odesk, it was very global, but the kind of obstacles were more logistical. Can you get money to this country? Can you reliably pay people? Do they have a sufficient internet bandwidth that they can do some kinds of tasks that would require high bandwidth? So in-person customer service support, that kind of thing. But one of the nice things about online work is the sort of infrastructural requirements of the country don't have to be there. Basically, can you get online? Can you get money? And you're kind of you're good to go.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're actually running out of time. So I want to say thank you so much. Or John, do you want to?